Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to start by thanking the team at X2 Biosystems, as well as Scott Grafton and his group at the UC Santa Barbara Brain Imaging Center for their many contributions to this work, as well as Tom and the whole Augmented World Expo organization for the opportunity to present to you today. There we go. And then next, acknowledge the many contributions of our customers and development partners who have guided, participated in, and supported X2's ongoing efforts to help maintain the brain health and safety of both athletes and the military. It's a rare day in the news that you don't read or hear something about the dangers of concussions in sports and the wide range of impairments that can arise from repetitive head impacts is now recognized as a serious public health challenge. Although most of the attention tends to be focused specifically at the issue of concussions, there's a lot of evidence now that has revealed that serious brain injuries can and in fact do happen even in the absence of any diagnosed concussion symptoms. So to address this challenge for the past 6 years, X2 Biosystems has been developing wearable sensors that can monitor the effects not just of a single big impact to the head, but the accumulation of multiple small impacts over time with the very simple goal of reducing the risks, reducing the incidence, and reducing the costs of related brain injuries. These devices have now become very important safety tools. X2 sensors are deployed today in a very wide range of athletic and military activities around the world. And the data coming from these devices has already fundamentally changed our understanding of how to diagnose, how to manage, and in many cases, how to reduce the incidence of injuries due to head impacts. And again, not just concussions. It turns out that you need very good coupling between the sensor and the skull if you're going to actually use the data to predict things like the forces, the motion, the stresses inside the brain, and the corresponding injury risk. The two wearable sensor form factors that can provide this coupling are a mouth guard fitted to the upper teeth, which are hard tissue and part of your skull, or a skin-affix sensor worn on what we call the mastoid process. You put your finger behind your ear, there's this bony spur that protrudes down in the skull where there's very little soft tissue between skin and skull, so you get very good coupling. The skin-affix sensors have the advantage that we can make them much higher volume and much lower cost. They're universally applicable to any activity. Not everyone wears a mouth guard. We actually pioneered censored mouth guards. The skin-affix sensors don't show the rapid degradation due to chewing that the mouth guards do. The skin-affix sensors are simply mounted behind the ear with a small two-sided biomedical adhesive. They contain very advanced miniaturized accelerometers and gyroscopes. They're able to measure the motion of the head with extreme precision, both along the X, Y, and Z axes, as well as the rotation around those. They sample at 6,000 times a second, and we can go as far as to take that data, actually predict the amount of energy dumped inside of the brain and where it gets deposited. So extrapolate that to potential location and severity of tissue damage. You're going to see some pictures along those lines shortly. It turns out that because, as you can see in this lower panel of pictures, the motion of a helmet very often by design is very different than the motion of the wearer's head. Sensors embedded in helmets have proven to be very unreliable when it comes to generating data used to actually look at injury risk in athletics. The sensors are typically used to monitor impacts accumulated as a function of player, as a function of position, whether it's in a single game or practice or over extended periods of time, in order to determine remove from play thresholds. When have you accumulated enough impact risk that you should be taken off the field, rest, recover, be further examined, as well as to identify players that just because of the way they play consistently put their head in harm's way or activities, either in games or in training, that do the same thing. Train it out of the players, remove the activities, or even to modify equipment and to modify games rules. So studies using the X2 sensors, for example, contributed to recommendations to eliminate heading from soccer up to the age of 14. And I'll show you some high-speed video results towards the end that'll explain why that might be a good thing to do. But even these very simple behavioral modification applications of the X2 devices, teaching safer practicing and playing techniques, have been shown in a number of recent landmark studies to reduce the risk of these high-risk head impacts and resulting injuries by 30 to 70%. So not only is that a lot of happier and healthier young athletes or men and women in uniform, when you consider that the cost of concussions just in the US, direct medical costs, lost productivity, is estimated to be someplace between $80 billion and $140 billion a year. A 30 to 70% reduction is a huge cost savings someplace in the system. Other key takeaways from many of the studies we've carried out with partners in the recent years. First and foremost, the observation that impact dynamics are really complex and no two impacts are ever the same. Even a single impact to the head can leave behind damage that's widely distributed in multiple locations. It's as important to monitor indirect blows to the body that set the head in motion violently as it is to track the effects of direct impacts to the head. And it's as important to track all those little impacts and their effect, not just the single big newsreel versions. More data is good. I'll show you an example of some of the things we're doing, leveraging our large data set to automate the process of characterizing impacts and the injury risk. And then finally, when the sensors are well coupled to the skull, the data they provide can actually give you pretty accurate predictors of whether or not a concussion has happened. So some examples, we're now starting to leverage X2's data set of over 5.5 million impact records to develop advanced data analytics tools, a lot of machine learning in particular, to automate the process of taking the impact as it happens, bounce it off that collection, and figure out what's the injury risk as it happens real time. Another really simple example is to figure out, is the data from the sensor that I just got, does that correspond to a real head impact? Or is it simple rhythmic motion due to running, for example, where there's no danger to the athlete? We might not want to track that as an accumulated risk. Or all the other things that can happen. A sensor that's loosely attached, it's just flapping away on its adhesive, right? A spurious impact that can happen just in the process of putting it on or taking it off. We don't want to call that something dangerous. And finally, a sensor has an offset error. It thinks it's exceeding a threshold, but it just needs to be adjusted. So all these things have to be taken into account. We can, and once we can identify the real impacts, we can take a big step forward and start turning these things into a real neuro-trauma dosimeter, just like that badge you wear when you walk into the nuclear reactor, and it measures how much radiation dosage you've accumulated and tells you when it's time to get out of the reactor. Here's a device, a little smaller, that tells you when it's time to get off the field or stop banging your head. So we do that by combining the sensors themselves with finite element models, digital models that we build of the brain that can take the sensor data as an input and tell us where the forces and stresses build up in the brain, actually predict tissue damage and changes in neural connectivity, which is very powerful information to have. And then finally, we're leveraging some very high resolution brain imaging techniques to pull all together, compare what we predict with what we're actually able to see in real life. The results shown here from a collaboration with Stanford University, biomechanical engineering, the Department of Athletics, and the School of Medicine that combined real-time data from the sensors during live athletic events. This combined football, boxing, and mixed martial arts. So we had a pretty broad range of pretty big blows to the head, along with finite element models that took the sensor data and were used to predict location, distribution of forces and stresses in the brain due to impacts that were observed using high-speed video, many of which actually led to diagnosed concussions. And the results revealed that the data from the sensors can, in fact, produce very strong predictors of whether or not a concussion has occurred, and that they all have a basis in very simple physical phenomena. First of all, the total impact power dumped in the brain due to taking a blow. Regardless of whether it goes into linear modes or rotational modes above a certain threshold, you're very likely to have suffered a concussion. Secondly, the peak rotational, the acceleration during the impact. Turns out that rapid spinning of the head is often implicated in the most serious injuries due to the fact that long neural fibers, you can stretch them, you can compress them, but when you rotate them, they tear. Right? And the final one, the peak strain in the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is that bundle of neural fibers between the two halves of your brain. You build up a lot of stress there. Not only is there a good likelihood you have a severe concussion, you're often unconscious. That's the knockout blow in boxing. So if we go a step further with these finite element models, we actually start putting in tissue-specific mechanical properties and all the morphological details, in particular those folds in the cortex. Our brains are too big for our skulls. Halfway through our time in the womb, the brain starts to fold. That's where these features come from. The tight bends are called the sulci. And the models predict some very interesting and important responses to impacts, particularly that you actually get stresses localized and built up to very high levels right around those features. So one implication of this is that even a relatively modest blow to the head, which traditionally would have thought to have been well below the safe threshold, can actually lead to localized forces sufficient to cause damage. And in fact, this is now the explanation being put forth for the observations that in the brains of NFL football players who were diagnosed after they died post-mortem to have suffered from CTE, the accumulation of these beta amyloid proteins, the plaques that are characteristic of CTE, are found predominantly exactly there, right at the bottom of the cortical sulci. So of course, we don't want to wait until they die to figure this out, right? We'd like to have a way to observe the onset and the evolution of this type of damage much earlier. So for this, this goal, we've enlisted the support of Scott Grafton and the folks at the UC Santa Barbara Brain Imaging Center, one of the highest resolution, most advanced brain imaging facilities in the world. It's a joint collaboration with UC Santa Barbara, Caltech, and MIT. A study we carried out in the fall of 2015 with UCSB's NCAA-ranked soccer teams. Very high resolution baseline brain images carried out for each of the players at the beginning of the season and then repeated at multiple intervals. All the athletes also wore sensors to monitor accumulated head impacts. And the UCSB team then applied recently developed very high resolution imaging techniques that can identify localized damage patterns. I'll show two interesting results here. First, very clearly and dominant pattern of damage at the front and the back of the cortex, exactly what you'd expect from many frontal headers in the ball, the brain bouncing back and forth in the skull. And again, these aren't NFL football players. These are 17 to 20-year-old female soccer players, and these are changes observed after only a single soccer season. Perhaps more profound, we've also observed, we believe, for the first time, as highlighted by the green circles, the first in vivo observations of localized damage, specifically at the bottom of the cortical sulci, as predicted by simulations. The implication here is that the onset of brain injuries such as CTE may actually be happening much earlier than an athlete's career than previously appreciated. A lot of work ongoing now to look at the time evolution of this damage and characterize it in more detail. But that is a very critical finding. If we now plot the damage severity as a function of the head impact power accumulated from all the little impacts up until each scan. Again, no concussions diagnosed here. We see a very clear threshold effect, and someplace above about 100 kilowatts of accumulated impact power, we begin to observe damage. So with the techniques we have, we can observe the damage. It's still an open question, is there damage before that, or is this just what we're able to observe? To give you a feel what those numbers mean, if you want to run the first video, so here's some high-speed video of a female college soccer player heading a soccer ball and the corresponding impact data. We see that the head, the brain inside, accelerates within about 10 milliseconds to 20 Gs, 18 to 20 Gs. Take the average mass of a female brain of about 1.22 kilograms. The fact that the brain moves about 10 centimeters in the process, that's a kilowatt. A kilowatt of power just got dumped in the brain. Oops, that was almost a kilowatt. In comparison, let's look at the football drill. So here's a routine, although they've stopped doing this, but here's what used to be a standard lineman's drill, regularly exceeds 40 Gs, 2 to 3 kilowatts. So if the threshold is someplace around 100, someplace between 30 to 100 of these things, which is, it's a week's worth of practice or games if you're hitting the soccer ball all the time, triggering damage. So the fact that we can now have thresholds to target avoiding, here I've actually plotted a histogram of the head impact powers for all of the individual impacts taken by the lady soccer players. You can see they're all down around 1, 2, 3 kilowatts, right? Any one of those is well below the thresholds I've identified for an impact causing a concussion, and yet their accumulated effect is revealing damage clearly distributed multiple locations throughout the brain. So because of this, the X2 sensors are now being explored in an even wider range of athletic and military environments to get more serious about protecting the brain health, not just the health of performance. If you invest the money that gets invested in training and in building up the performance of an athlete or a special ops service person, you don't want to go and trash the computer that controls it all, right? So preserving the brain health and the performance by limiting those accumulated head impact exposures to levels below observable damage thresholds, which is a very exciting thing to be able to do these days. And then finally, because the sensors are also saying something about the location and magnitude of energy being dumped in the brain, and because we now understand a lot about the pathophysiology of neural damage, everything that can happen to a cell, and all the biomarkers that get generated in the process, whether they show up in saliva or perspiration or blood or urine, now you have a device that can give you an indication of, well, for a given impact or series of impacts, which of all those possible biomarkers might actually be expected to appear in the highest concentration, the one to go looking for, right? So a tool to also assess the effectiveness of some of these new head injury diagnostics. So I'll close there. We are making a lot of exciting progress in developing a true neuro-trauma dosimeter, combining the sensors, these digital models of the brain, very high resolution brain imaging. We have recently shown with our collaborators that the cumulative trauma we measure with the sensors actually correlates with damage that's both predicted and observed. And finally, because of all this, the X2 devices are emerging as the most promising approach to monitoring the accumulated effects of subconcussive impacts in generating much more comprehensive and also more personalized removed from play thresholds. I'll close with a quick word from our sponsor. We're excited to be showcasing here at this year's Expo the next generation X-Patch Pro sensor and data management app, both shown here. I'll invite all of you to come by the X2 booth here on the show floor, take a swing at our bobblehead demo, and we love to discuss all the opportunities to use the X2 technology, to join the team, or even to invest in one of the most exciting and certainly one of the most rewarding wearable opportunities out there in the market. Thank you.